Right. So I'm here to talk about TanStack Router. My name is Mikkel Andersen. I've been doing software for over 20 years. Today, before we start talking about TanStack, I want to mention a little bit about our setup tracking when it comes to our NX Workspace, our mobile repo, because it's rather big, and that's one of the reasons why TanStack is providing a ton of value for us. We'll go over the NX Workspace, and we'll talk about what TanStack is. It's not just a router, it's actually a suite of tools. We'll dig into some live demos because it's a lot more fun. If we look at our NX mobile repo, we have 387,000 lines of code. Of that, only 127,000 lines of code needs to be unit tested. In other words, we have a ton of auto-generated code that's committed because then NX knows what is actually changing. When we merge to master, it doesn't have to build everything. It only builds what is actually changed since the last commit. We have 587 different projects in this repo. That's a lot. Just trying to grasp the lines between the dependencies is really hard. We have 54 public libraries in this repo. You can go to npm.js and find the track unit, and there'll be some of our dependencies in there. For our host application, which is the main thing in this repo, there's 155 different routes. So trying to manage that and make sure that if I make a change over here that links to this other page over here, that it might break if I'm changing over here, but not over here, right? So if you're deep linking into different pages, it's really a hassle. That's where TanStack Router comes in. We have a release train right now that takes 45 minutes. So whenever someone merges to master, it takes 45 minutes and then it's in production. And doing that, it means that everything has to work. There'll be no manual testing when I merge to master. So we look at this as our test pyramid. So we have all the static information, which is the one that catches all these typos or the type errors when you write the code. If I'm changing the parameters for one page, all the query parameters for one page, I want to be able to commit, and then the build server can tell me if I messed up in other places of the application. That's the first level of defense we have, right? So the more we have in this, the easier it is to manage the code base. Because if you go up the chain, then you start adding unit tests. So very isolated tests and focusing on testing that one unit, right? We actually don't have a lot of those, but we have a ton of integration tests where we are testing the whole page or the whole component or whatever. We try to say, okay, this is a component. We test all the inputs and outputs of that. At the top of the pyramid, we have a small set of Cypress tests verifying that, okay, the page is actually also loaded together with our backend. That's also very important in order to release software really. So about a year ago, we started looking into TanStack. TanStack has exactly what we need, the lower level tier of the platform, making sure everything is type safe from the ground up. They also have another thing that's really interesting. That's that they're trying to be vendor agnostic. We're using their table and we're using the router. Today, I'll talk primarily of the router, but the table, for instance, it's just a component library that is completely headless. So there's no UI for it. You get to write it in Vue or Angular or React or whatever you want. So we can reuse the components that we are building today to be vendor agnostic when it comes to the framework down the line. And that's because we're building a platform, right? We are a React business, but the way we expose our APIs to external is that external engineers can actually build into our application. And that's inside an iframe. The developers don't know that it's an iframe, but that makes sure we can isolate and they can run with React 17 and we run with React 19. That would not be possible if we didn't do it this way. On the other side, they could also be writing in Angular, and we don't need to care as long as they make it look the same. So the look and feel, we have a CSS library that can make sure that, okay, if you did use Angular, you can use our CSS variables to make sure that it looks the same. So this is the full TanStack list. The most interesting new thing is this start. And they're trying to solve all the building parts and making everything so much easier for you as a developer. If you use this, then it just magically works. I'm not a big fan of these frameworks that say, I can fix all problems for you. I like that we can pick the React table and say, that's a key component that we need in our platform. So we can pull that in and it provides a ton of value. thing with the TanStack router at the point of entry for us. There were no way of making it type safe the router unless you were using TanStack router. So we switched to TanStack router, and it is a modern and scalable routing for React and solid applications. It's not just React. It can be used in other cases as well. It's fully type safe. Whenever I change one thing on the params, then the type safe will complain somewhere else. And that helps fix all these navigation issues we've had before. I hope you can see the screen here. This is a simple React application. This app has an account of 2 and the context, and it's rendering the router. The router is the TanStack router. And we're then passing in the router, which we're creating right here. This is all we need to do in order to set up the TanStack router. The magic happens here, where we start building a menu. Our root application has a main menu and an outlet. That's where all the UI will be located. And then we're using this TanStack router dev tools, which can come in handy when you are trying to debug why things are loading in a different way, or why is state not in the right way that you expected. And then we have an index or slash, that means the whole page. And then we have a Star Wars route. And this is where it gets interesting. So I can create a new route where I say, hey, please validate that the search params has a count. And then here we use SOC, just like Casper showed earlier. SOC is a great framework to make sure that you have type safety from the beginning. And here I'm saying I want a number and I want to catch back to 2. I could also do optional or default. But if I don't do the catch, it would crash if I type in nickel in the URL. And I don't want that, right? I want to say, okay, that was an invalid value, so I'll just catch it and then give it the number 2 instead. Then there's a path called Star Wars, and then that renders this Star Wars component. You can also do lazy loading, which is exactly what we're doing. You don't want everything to be populated in your main application. We can also supply a pending component. So while this is loading, it will show this loading profile. You have a pure component here that doesn't need to know what happens to load data. It says, when I'm loading this page, I have this data available. And that happens using this loader. But every route can have a loader. Before I get to render the Star Wars page, all of this needs to be downloaded first. In this case, I'm just fetching some Star Wars movies from my backend. So I have a very simple backend running and a service that can fetch the Star Wars data. It's just a fetch call, and it's not interesting for the demo here. Then I'm saying, okay, return those data points and return the count here. And then something needs to happen here. So this route is part of the root route. So you're giving it its parent, and then you're also passing it further down. Let's just close this one. We'll get back to these 2 routes. And then down here, you create the router tree where you say we have a root route with an index file and a Star Wars route. And then we're creating this router where we're saying, if there's something pending for more than 200 milliseconds, then I want it to switch to the loading state. Which is really convenient. If you have something where it's often really slow, maybe this makes sense to jump down to 200 milliseconds so you easily get a spinner. But if you have like something that's, 100 milliseconds and then your backend already responded, maybe you don't want it to show a spinner it takes time to put into the DOM, render it, and then put it out to render something different. So you get to decide when you want to do that. And then the last part is this context. Context is whatever you need in order to make the loader work. So if you needed some context, whether you're authenticated or not, you can put that in here and say, okay, don't load this page unless you are authenticated. And then you actually declare the type right here, saying whenever you use the TanStack router, the router is of this type. This is the magic that makes sure that no matter where you are in your application, it knows exactly what the router is and how it looks. So when I go to Star Wars now, then I can see that my Star Wars page is just a React component. It's using a couple of features from TanStack Router, like use the loaded data. And here again, I have type safety because I already declared when I defined the type of the return value that it was a movie. I get movies back here. And same with accounts. I know that it's a number. I made sure that it's not an optional number, so it can never be undefined. I'll never be able to render this page where the count is undefined, which is really convenient. It should never be undefined. Let's make sure that it is not undefined. And then the navigate, which is nice if you want to navigate and update the search params or navigate to a different page. And then let's just show more here. All right, so this was the whole page. And then we have the Star Wars movie. When I click, you saw the loading state after 200 milliseconds, and then it actually downloads. We have this counter, and when I click up, I show one more example. It's meant to update the state. And as you can see up here, it says count 3. So when I refresh this browser, it will remember that there were 3 counts in it. Now, if I go back to the router and I go to my Star Wars page and I say, I want it to be called number 2, you see it right away. And you can go up here and see, oh, counts doesn't exist. So you have the type safety there. You also have it if you say this is a string. Now it's a string. Of course, if I am not using it as a string, it's proof that we have type safety from just not the variables, but even down to the property. Let's try again. All right. So if we move on to the next example, we have a loading state where it gets a little bit more tricky. I realized that the counts I can give instantly, but the movies I can get after 300 milliseconds. Actually, 3 seconds. So after 3 seconds, this will return the movies. I can say, hey, return this data whenever you are asking for it in the page, but defer these information. So you can get the count instantly and then the solution of this. And the way that looks when you then look at the implementation is that you are still pulling out the Star Wars movies, and you can see that this is a promise. And the way you deal with the promise is you use this await, which is part of TanStack. So you can then say, okay, I know the count is there instantly, so I can render the dropdown with the numbers, and then I can defer until later that we want to show these. And I can put that in a suspense so it will show loading Star Wars movies. And when I click on this page, it will say it's deferred, loading Star Wars movies, and then it renders the 2. Then we switch to 5, don't touch the keyboard, and then because it had 5 at the point when the data comes, so you get to choose what is important. Is it important to render instantly for him? Or is it important that, hey, I just want all the data up front, and then the UI can be delayed until you have all the data? It's really powerful and type-sync all the way. When we come to navigation, this was talking about the query frames. When we talk about navigation, here I have this link to the page, right? When we click on the router, you have the movie route, which is just saying, hey, I have a movie. ID means that it's some unique ID. You can also do validation on this and say it can only be a UUID or only be a string with these number of characters. So again, you can get all the type safety you want. By default, it's just a string. And then you can use the loader here. If the number ID is equal to the episode, then I'm looking at the right movie and returning that movie to my page. So whenever I click on the page here, since loading the movie, and if we look at the movie page from the implementation, we can see that, again, we can get the data out. We can also use the params. In this case, like I said, it default to a string, but I could also put into the validation that it should be UUID, and then I'll be able to get just the UUID. In our mono repo, we have a slightly different setup because we wanted to be able to test all of this. So we created the router without creating any components at all. We're not linking to the implementation at all. We have one library of the 587 libraries just talking about routers. We have 150,000 routes, but no definition of the components. And then in the host application, we set up the router like I'm doing here. I'm making to that definition, but then mapping each route to the individual component. that means I can take that library down below and say, I can use that for testing. So for all the other libraries that we're unit testing, if they reference the router, I know that they don't have to load up the whole world, which is really nice to know because that takes time. And we want to separate the concerns of that.